We are awakening. We are awakening.
All right. Hello, everyone. And hello, Dr. Jeffrey Martin. My name is Regina. Hi, it's nice to meet you. Let me turn you up a little bit. There you go.
Sounds good.
Perfect. So thanks for coming. And
thank you. I saw it pop up on my schedule today.
well,
Happy Father's Day to at least George, probably.
At least George, yeah. Now, since you mentioned that it popped up on your schedule, it popped up on my schedule too. And one of the things I noticed when it popped up was it said an hour. We were planning on 90 minutes. How is that for you?
Oh, wow. Really? Okay.
Yeah, if you can't do it, just okay. If you can't do it, just let us know. But that is what we were planning. So,
see what you have in mind.
Okay, are you a father?
No.
Okay, well then, then we're not keeping you away from
anybody.
However,
still have to call my dad.
Oh, okay. Oh, me too. Thank you for saying that. Me too. Oh my goodness. I really appreciate that. All right. So, Dr. Jeffrey Martin has written this book called The Finders. I know you guys are familiar with this because we've been talking about this
the hardback.
Last couple of weeks. No, actually, it's soft. It just looks hard in Zoom, I guess.
Oh, okay.
And what I would like to do in the beginning is just cover some very basics so they understand where we're coming from in the rest of the interview. So do you want to just tell them a little bit about the, about the research you did in writing this book?
Sure. So that book comes from 12, 13 years at this point of research. We can just subtract out 2006 from whatever year it is. We'll come up with the actual number of that because that's when we started. And it basically is the largest project ever put together to try to understand people who represent themselves in sort of so-called higher levels of consciousness. So whether it's enlightenment or non-duality or persistent mystical consciousness or God consciousness or unity consciousness, we have hundreds of these cataloged, different terms from all around the world. It took place in 2 phases. The first phase was us really just trying to get our arms around them from the standpoint of psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, physiology, just trying to figure out basically what was different, if anything, about these individuals, besides what they represented from their own sort of subjective, statements about the world and how they experienced it. And then we had a second phase after that. What shook out of that was what's in that book, actually. So that book was actually originally written in 2010. And not released until this year because it was being tweaked and tuned and tweaked and tuned. I don't know if you've heard of a friend of mine. His name's Ken Wilber. He's written a bunch of books. Ken is sort of notorious for having sort of written as he went. And so, his books don't always agree with each other. And people say there was like his Ken Wilber 1's thoughts and then Ken Wilber 2's thoughts. And then so I did not want to fall into that same pattern. I sort of learned from, history a little bit. I learned from what he'd done. And I thought, I don't want them out there saying, oh, that's Jeffrey 1 and this is Jeffrey 6, like he has to go through. So I thought I'm going to wait until I'm pretty sure we're not going to revise this thing. Or if it's revised, it's going to be in such a major way that we throw it all out. And so that's why it came out this year. So that basically covers that body of information. And what shook out of that, aside from some of the obvious, like what's happening in the brain and things like that, was the first really cross-cultural pan-tradition map, if you will, of the cognitive science and psychological buckets that people fall into that experience these types of things. We only study persistence. I don't know anything really about temporary states. So this is all the stuff that sticks. And our benchmark for that was whether or not it stuck for a year.
Okay, that's nice to know.
So it was at least a year. Usually it was people that were in it for decades, obviously, though we did try to get a certain percentage of the population close to the year point, just so we had representation across the whole spectrum. And then after that, it was a question of could we validate their claims empirically in any way? And so the first thing that was obviously important to us was to try to get pre and post data, because up to that point we had people representing this stuff after the fact, sometimes decades after the fact, and they weren't able to tell us really who they were before, or not with any degree of accuracy, and they knew that. And so we thought, okay, well, we've got to get A/B data. We've got to get pre and post data on these people so that we can measure the psychological differences that take place and the neuroscientific and the other differences that take place. And so then we started a second experiment to do that. And so, at that point, I more or less knew everybody all around the world that was sort of in the space in some way, because we had thousands of participants in the first. It was officially 1,200 participants in the first phase of the research. But, there were so many other people that didn't officially participate, that still casually interfaced with the project and all of that. So what we wound up actually doing was creating a protocol that we could use to reliably transition people. And so we did that, and then we measured, 500 people or something like that, before and after. It's still ongoing. We still collect data on that. We really ended the formal experiment of that last year at the end of 2018. We just had enough data. It was already so ridiculously statistically significant. It wasn't going to get more statistically significant. But we've kept it out there online as a class that people can take, because that's the format that we put it in, so that we could attract people to try it from all around the world. We didn't want this to be a bunch of, most psychology, I don't know if you know this or not, but most psychology papers are written off of undergraduate students who are taking Psych 101 classes, because they're who the professors can force to do their stuff. And so you have this huge bias in the psychological literature that's not for real people and not towards real people. And we did not want that. And so we structured the experiment very differently. We tried to attract people from the public. We made it sort of this giant crowdsourced, crowd-funded sort of thing. And so we just kept that as a class afterward. We're still accumulating the data for machine learning and for artificial intelligence. When it gets to about 10,000 people, if there ever are 10,000 people that take it, then we'll have enough data at that point, basically, to give it to artificial intelligence engineers and see what kind of extra cool stuff they find.
Wow.
So we went from that, and then we started, we had this problem where there were like hundreds of people who had transitioned to what we call fundamental well-being publicly, or persistent non-symbolic experience academically. Those are just our bucket terms for the things that I mentioned earlier. And they were, basically needing adjustment advice, because once you transition to this, you suddenly find yourself living in a world that is entirely occupied by all of the neurotic people that you used to be one of. And, you fit in with them really, really well when you were, neurotic like they were, but now you're not neurotic anymore. And you've had this fundamental way of how you relate to the world, these changes in terms of how you relate to the world and stuff. And so we wound up having to actually create follow-on research project that I didn't anticipate to deal with that a little bit. And then we've created some programs. They're not really public per se, programs that are still sort of in our experimental pipeline for that. So if you ever hear anybody refer to the quote-unquote the Explorers course, the Finders course was the first thing that transitioned people, right? And then there's the Explorers course. That's sort of a quasi, public-y, not that public-y. Like there is no page where you can go and sign up for the Explorers course.
Right. Okay.
Or anything like that. So, but we do have at explorerscourse.com, just in case anybody ever hears of that experiment and thinks to themselves, gosh, that sounds great. We have some free videos up for people there that they can at least see. It's like sort of the best practice stuff, for like the thing that everybody should know that has transitioned to fundamental well-being. But there's nothing you can do except watch those videos. There's nowhere to go basically further on that webpage. So that's the story. That's basically what we've been up to for all this time. We started doing brain zapping. I'm in the last week of a house here in Silicon Valley where we've been testing out transcranial ultrasound and actually zapping people, direct non-invasive direct brain stimulation using ultrasound, focused ultrasound, into these states. We're getting ready to move this facility, which is finished with its proof of concept after 11 months, to most likely, we're still a little up in the air. We were planning on going to San Diego, but we've recently gotten an invitation to stay at a lab in San Francisco, and my main guy here wants to stay. So I don't know, we'll either be in San Diego next week or we'll be in San Francisco next week, and taking this project to sort of the next phase, which is going to be measuring the brain, interpreting that with machine learning algorithms and stuff like that, and then stimulating the brain based on the actual feedback from the brain. What we've been doing up to this point is stimulating the brain based on basically the spots in the brain that we were able to identify with fMRI research on fundamental well-being people 2009, 2010, 2011, in an earlier
Thank you.
part of the project. So that gives you the whole overview.
Flew through a couple of symbols that not everybody here is familiar with. So if you could tell everyone what persistent non-symbolic experience is and what fundamental well-being is, and if there's a difference between the two, what that is.
Absolutely. Those are both our terms for, there are bucket terms, basically, our collective terms, if you will, for what the public might call things like enlightenment or non-duality, persistent mystical consciousness, all those things that I mentioned before, and hundreds of others. So those types of ways of subjectively experiencing the world, we needed catch-all terms for them. And so for a long time in our research, we just used persistent non-symbolic experience or persistent non-symbolic consciousness. The main center that we did it all out of was the Center for the Study of Non-Symbolic Consciousness. So that word's been around since about 2008. And then, you know, when we started to talk to people in the public, PNSE was sort of a mouthful for them. And so we needed a new word. And we really thought about it, and we settled on fundamental well-being, because that's basically what it feels like. I mean, if we were trying to advertise this or something, we call it extraordinary well-being or something like that, right? Because fundamental well-being is not that sexy. But it feels like a deep, fundamental sense of well-being. And so we felt that was the most accurate description of it.
And then another term you use is the narrative self. That's similar to what many people might call the ego, right? Or the false self or the imposter. Is that true?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, sure. And finders. Finders are?
Finders are people who experience fundamental well-being.
Okay, good, good. Just want to get the terms out there, because it's, you know, it's unfortunate if we're talking and people don't understand what the heck we're saying because we're speaking a different language. So I want to throw that out there first. All right, so what I've done is I've gone through the book, and I have, you know, I've read it, underlined it, and then went back and highlighted things that I really wanted to focus on in our questioning. And I think probably the first thing I want to focus on is the fact that you have a continuum. So if you could just tell them briefly about this continuum so they'll know what it is as we're talking about it.
Sure. So as we were researching in the first phase of the study, people's psychological experiences basically clustered into what we initially sort of called buckets. You know, we were sort of like, oh, you're in bucket 1, or you're in bucket 2, or you're in bucket 3, just sort of different forms of this experience that people were clearly sharing. So the first thing that we learned was really it's not all just one thing, that there are different forms of it. And then we began to sort their subjective reports into these different categories, if you will. And we were doing that primarily for neuroimaging, because although people think that, you know, you see on the news somebody at an fMRI scanner or something, and they have a camera pointed over the scientist's shoulder, and they're sort of scanning through, and it's like the whole brain flashes by and all of that. That's absolutely not how fMRI or brain research works. You have to very carefully construct your hypothesis and have very specific interactions, know exactly where you think you're looking in the brain, tune the thing for it, all of that. And so there's a lot of pre-work. There's 3 to 7 years in a novel area like ours of pre-work that goes into just sorting subjects and coming up with best guesses in terms of how to even begin measurement of them. And that's the phase that we were in. And so we were basically trying to identify these people. Were they one population? Were they several individual populations? And then type them, see if we could sort people into different types if there wasn't just one big population and all of that. And what came from that was something that we decided to publicly call the continuum, because it's just a continuum of related experience, really. And so if you think about a number line, that's the continuum, right? From 1 to 10 or whatever the number line is between. And as you go through that, it's still, you know, if you're at a 3 on the number line, you know, okay, you're not the 1 on the number line, but you're still on the number line, right? You're not somewhere else and floating around in space and time or whatever. You're related to the 1 because you're kind of on the same number line, right? So we wanted people to have that kind of association with it. And then the other thing about a number line and that type of continuum is that 3 isn't, there's nothing that says that 3 is better than 1. You know, unless you put a scale above the number line saying 10 is awesome and 1 is horrible. I mean, you could just as easily flip those labels, and 1 could be awesome and 10 could be horrible, right? And so it sort of flattens the whole thing, where a lot of traditions, spiritual traditions, religions, and stuff like that, they've liked to sort of pick their favorites. They've picked their favorite part of the continuum in many cases, and then they've picked what they think is superior to other locations on the continuum and stuff like that. And we just didn't really feel it was appropriate from sort of a modernity perspective to have that type of view of this. It's type 3, if you want to think of it that way, or what we call location 3. That's really useful for some things and really terrible for other things in modern life. And so, should everyone be in location 3? No, depends on your life. It depends on if you're running a business, location 3 is probably not for you unless you want to be bankrupt in a year from giving away all your resources, because it's sort of this place it's kind of the end of the Christian mystical tradition where you're sort of in union with the divine, or the panpsychist sense if you don't get the divine sense, which panpsychism, if you're not familiar with it, is just kind of a philosophical term that relates to sort of everything feeling conscious or that type of thing. So people feel a sense of union with that. They feel have this sort of core emotion that's kind of a combination between love and joy and compassion. It can be some other stuff depending on their culture and their programming and stuff like that. And so anyway, bottom line is it's not the best place to run a company from.
Okay.
And whereas location 2 is a fine place to run a company from. Location 3 is a dual place, if you're familiar with dual, non-dual type terms in this podcast. Location 2 is non-dual, location 3 is dual. And so location 2, if you ever heard of like the Science and Non-Duality Conference that happens out here in basically the Bay Area, more or less the teachers that speak at the Science and Non-Duality Conference are in location 2. And so, there's a non-dual sense to it. You're likely to be, happier than not. You're likely to have a balance in your emotionality towards more positive emotions with fewer negative emotions. You have, a reduced sense of internal chatter, negative chatter, and stuff like that. The sort of self-referential thoughts that people have about, how bad things are for them and all of that have, they're died down pretty well by that point. But you have a sense of agency. You're not in some sort of, love state overall. You don't feel merged with the divine or something, generally speaking. And so you can run a business just fine from location 2, but I wouldn't really recommend it unless maybe it was a church or something and you had a business manager underneath you for location 3.
Well, it's interesting because when I listening to you and when I read the book, it felt like you were using the terms non-dual and unity differently, where I've always used them to be the same. So what is the difference between non-dual and unity?
Well, that's a good question. I think another way to think about that, it's important for people to think about, is there's so many different forms of non-duality. And so, even in location 2, there are so many different forms of non-duality. I mean, if you were to go to something like the Science and Non-Duality Conference and listen to people talk about their perception of non-duality, or do what I do, which is sit around with the teachers, and the people that speak there, and listen to them talk to each other or me or whoever about it. It's amazing the variety of non-duality that exists just within location 2. Location 4 is also a non-dual location, as there's some locations beyond it, but they are like a much more unified type of non-duality, almost like a concretized or more complete version, if you will, of non-duality than location 2 is. And so you get all this variation in location 2. So when I use union in the book, it's really primarily associated with location 3, and it's associated with that union experience with either the divine or sort of this panpsychist sense of how things can show up. And so that's different. That's dual, if you think about it, because how can you be sort of increasingly going towards merger or union with something outside of yourself if you're non-dual?
Right.
It's just not possible.
Right.
There are some people who have picked this up, incidentally. It's not just sort of our findings. Like I was having dinner one time with John Hagelin. I don't know if you know who that is. He's the guy who runs the TM movement basically in North America. And we were both speaking at the same thing. And so he had new slides, and he's like, hey, let me go through my slides with you right before dinner, while we were at dinner. And and he got to this slide that was there. So they have 7 levels basically in their system. And the first 3 are waking, sleeping, dreaming type stuff, like normal, everybody has it kind of stuff. And then you get, in 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 to their sort of higher levels, if you will, of consciousness. And in his 4th one, it was dual. In his 5th one, it was non-dual. In his 6th one, it was dual. And in his 7th, it was non-dual. And I said, geez, I don't usually see this represented like this. Where did this come from? And he said, oh, we get that from the Vedas. And so these old texts, apparently, and I'm not a religious scholar, that's for sure, but these old texts, apparently, people have basically known about sort of this delineation. You could easily put, location 1, 2, 3, 4 on his chart there, except that they scrunch a lot into the top location. And it's to be a little muddier between location 3 and location 4 in there, as they kind of jam a bunch, and we separate a whole bunch more out.
Okay, yeah, and can you just tell us how many locations you have?
We have no idea.
You have no idea. Okay, that's a fair answer.
It's supposed to get muddy in the low 20s,
Okay. Okay, and so
there's just so few people that experience that.
Right, and in fact, if I remember correctly, you said the majority of the people are in location 1, 2, and 3, and then from location 4 and above, it becomes much more rare.
Yeah, that's true, and especially from 5 on up.
From 5 on up.
We've noticed that since we've had our outreach efforts, location 4 seems to be becoming increasingly common.
Okay.
And so too does even location 5 compared to when we were first doing the research a long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
Now that could just be the population of our own research participants that we're helping along. Frankly, it's not like we're seeing that in the public. But it is interesting that we're seeing these hundreds of people that we track. Basically, there's a skew that's gone on over the years that we've been working with our sort of core research population, the people that took part in that experiment, especially the first 11 cohorts of it, which took place over 4 or 5 years or so. Those people have shifted a lot, where initially they looked like the same distribution that we had from the public, which were most of them in 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4, but 4 being a lot rarer, and then 4 plus is we called it 4 plus at one time. Now we call it 5 plus because we realized 4 plus was a little bit muddy if you also had a 4. Somebody pointed that out to us finally. They're like, you have 4 and 4 plus. Like if I'm in 4. Well, good point. We'll change that to 5 plus, right?
Yeah.
So that's right. That's the normal distribution. But we do see people progressing and moving, at least in our research population. In the mainstream population, it's a little trickier because what often happens is there's a lot of dogmatism, there's a lot of belief system stuff and whatnot, and that kind of locks people in. Like some people are out there looking for location 4, and if they're in location 2, they think they're nowhere because they're not in location 4, and so they just consider themselves as being a failure in this whole higher level of consciousness thing. And so there's a lot of that kind of stuff that's out there, and or someone else might have, they might be in sort of the Neo-Advaita camp, where location 2, sort of like the sand people, right? Where location 2 is where it's at, and they're just like, rooting into location 2. And when a location 4 person wanders into the conference or, into their crowd, they're like, wow, I don't know what's wrong with that person, but they're really screwed up. They're not in fundamental well-being. Gary Weber is a good example of somebody who had that difficulty. He was in location 4. He would go and speak at Sand. He would sound very different than everybody else at Sand, and he would just sort of go back to his hotel room alone at night.
Right.
And so there's a lot of this stuff around ideas and dogmatism and whatnot that can really lock you in, and I think also prevent you from getting there. I think even just people knowing that it's a lot easier to get to, that's really helpful. And I'll tell you another thing I think is really helpful, and that is to realize that the people who's written most of the books have had the weirdest experiences. And so, the average person that transitions to fundamental well-being just sort of goes on with their life. They don't, become a teacher and start writing books and start traveling around the world talking about themselves. They basically mention it to their spouse or something, and their spouse looks at them like they have 3 heads. And then they don't mention it again, right? And they just sort of go on with their life And, so the people who write the books are the people who have these really, sort of out there experiences, and it sort of colors the perception of the whole experience. It colors the perception, if you will, of the whole space. Maslow noticed this with peak experiences a long time ago. He died in June 1970, the same year, basically a few days before I was born. And he was, of course, the world's leading expert on peak experience, sort of created the whole peak experience thing. He was the head of the American Psychological Association. Still, I'm sure if you ask people to list 5 famous psychologists, they probably couldn't, but at least Maslow would be on one of their fingers, right? Mm-hmm. Just before he transitioned, just before he died, he had serious cardiac issues for the last couple of years of his life. And as part of that, he transitioned to fundamental well-being. And he sort of rewrote his stuff, but he wasn't strong enough to get it out there. And so, his top level, the pyramid that you see, that's the self-actualization pyramid and all that, he never actually made that. That's not actually his. But everybody attributes it as his pyramid or whatever, so we'll just pretend that it is for purposes of this show. Face everybody has to Maslow. It's actually written by a business professor to put in a textbook, in a business textbook. And it doesn't quite represent his theory so accurately. But the one thing that is right is that sort of he did put self-actualization kind of at the top, And just before he died, he sort of reworked that. And he said, I got the self-actualization thing wrong. It's actually self-transcendence, this persistent state of self-transcendence. And he realized that the peak experiences they all had high arousal, they all had a lot of energy associated with them, stuff like that. You can never really live from a peak experience. And he called this a high plateau experience, not a peak experience. That was his term for fundamental well-being. And his notion of a high plateau experience was essentially the settling in of peace. He called it, what the mystical experience looks like if it takes hold. And you can sort of live your life as the great mystics do. You can run a grocery store and pay your bills and still see the world as miraculous and all of that. And so with the peak experience, people have peak experiences from drugs or from whatever else. They're often chasing the wrong thing. They think that they've had this glimpse of what it is. And they haven't had a glimpse of what it is. They had a glimpse of something sort of close to it, kind of related to it. We know now that the brainwaves are very different between these things. So even physiologically in the body, they're not the same thing. And you have that same thing, I think, in the public literature on this, because the teachers who transition to this, who are the ones out there writing about it, who are sort of creating the lore in people's heads about what this is, they're like the tiniest percentage of people that transitioned. And there's very few voices that are different than that. Bob Foreman is a good voice for that. He wrote a book called Enlightenment Ain't What It's Cracked Up to Be. And, he's a great academic who followed the TM movement for a long time and then had a transition and realized, wow, this is nothing like what they told me it was going to be. Where's my road paved with gold and all of my wealth and virgins and, all of these sort of promises that were kind of made in his movement anyway. So there's a lot of misconceptions around this. That's one of the reasons that I thought the book would be helpful. The book is primarily written for finders. I wanted our first major output to be for the people who were nice enough to spend all of their time inviting us into their home over the years and whatever else. And so it's a book that, it's the first book I've ever written that was designed not to be a bestseller. It's designed for a very tiny part. It's designed to make sense to a very tiny part of the population, and hopefully to sort of realign into a more realistic frame a handful of other people that are trying to get there.
Yeah. Now I have 2 questions, and I don't know which one to ask first, so maybe I'll ask them together and see where you go with this. The first question is, I noticed the only person that you mentioned by name in the book was Bernadette Roberts, and we happen to be pretty familiar with Bernadette Roberts. And we're very familiar with how she referred to it as 2 movements. She referred to the unity state falling away, which is your location 3, and she moved into what you would call location 4. Prior to Bernadette Roberts, though, through looking at other teachings, we had kind of come to the conclusion that there are two awakenings, and so I wanted to know a little bit about your thoughts on that, because Bernadette Roberts seems to say the same thing, and I know you're familiar with her. My other question, which is maybe related, maybe not, is, some teachers like Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta Maharaj, they refer to no world. And in fact, I don't know if you're familiar with A Course in Miracles, but A Course in Miracles refers to first an awakening to what it calls the real world. And then it says the real world is still a dream. And then there's an awakening beyond perception entirely. So I guess my question is, first of all, what are your thoughts about these two awakenings or two movements like Bernadette Roberts talks about? And secondly, have you run across anyone in your research who claims to not perceive a world? There you
go. Okay, so you're right, I think, about Bernadette, who was one of our research subjects, passed away now, of course. So. Mm-hmm. And she basically, it was location 3, location 4. As you know, she was originally a Carmelite nun. And so she, followed the classic Christian mystical path, which is essentially location 3, until she fell off the end of it accidentally and into location 4 and struggled with that for a long time. And she is, if you knew her, she is a classic deep in location 4 person. And so I remember one time she invited me to come to, she used to do these gatherings, these 13 person mm-hmm. gatherings or something once a year. And so she invited me to come to one of those as part of the research. And I just so happened to be, it was perfect timing. I was driving a car out west rather than shipping it. And I had just left Boulder where I hung out with Ken Wilbur, and I was going to pass through LA on my way to take the car up to San Francisco, and it was that moment. And she's like, if you happen to be around, I'm doing this thing. All right, so I stopped by, and I watched her do this workshop basically, and it was fascinating, because that was not that many years ago. That was just maybe a few years ago. I can't remember when it was. I'd have to look at my notes. It's too many people and too many things. But it was fascinating watching her interact with a group of 13 or whatever it was people from such a deconditioned location 4 state, right? I mean, I remember she had everybody go around and do intros, and I don't think there was anybody that didn't get everything that they said invalidated, by her during the intro. Right. And so then she took a break after the intro, and the guy that was sitting next to me in between me and her, he was still missing right after the break, and we were waiting for him. She's lecturing everybody to be on time, and this is disrespectful and whatever else. And finally and these people were already sort of scared to speak right after the intros. But finally somebody sort of across the circle said, I think I saw him leaving with his bag. And she didn't miss a beat. She was just like, that happens all the time. Right? And so when I talk in the book about how sort of your social interaction, conditioning and stuff really strongly deconditions the longer you're in a location like location 4, I was like, wow, what great examples I'm going to get out of this weekend, or whatever it was. I don't remember if it was a weekend or a week, or I can't remember much about it, except what I remember from the participant data, from her. So yeah, she was totally deep in location 4. But, by the time our research came around, that's for sure. And a classic example of it. But, your question really highlights the fact that there are so many of these locations, right? I couldn't, obviously, I don't read stuff from people. Okay. I have this ridiculously large library of books people have given me that they've written over time. And I haven't really read any of them, but I don't feel,
you don't want me to send you my books
rude and be like, no, keep your book. I've got what I need. So, I take the books graciously, and we put them in our library at our lab. People do read them, and, whatever else. Sometimes they drift away into people's private collections or PhD students or whatever, right? But one of the things that you can think about involving this is, I think there are people that have been associated with the research that did know people and did study under people like our Nisargadatta, right? None of them have given me permission to say who they are.
That's fine.
But there was
We don't
one
need
person
names.
who didn't really participate in the research, but who I just have had conversations with, so he's not covered by that per se, and I know he said these types of things publicly, and that is John Wheeler.
Okay.
So I don't know if you know who
John
Wheeler is or not,
Yes.
but he's actually a tech writer out here in the Bay Area, and I remember him telling me that he was fascinated by these seemingly stray phrases in these Nisargadatta books that didn't seem to fit with the rest of the text. And if I'm remembering right, I believe he said that Nisargadatta didn't write anything. That was like all the people that were like sitting around him that were writing it. And so he was thinking to himself, this guy was trying to convey something, but the people that were writing it, later, had no idea what it was or where it fit in, but they just kind of remembered these little snippets, and they would sort of stick them in here and there in their texts, and he was sort of fascinated by those. And so he told me that he spent like lots of vacations traveling to India trying to find people who had actually studied under Nisargadatta, and eventually one year he succeeded at that. And so he found these people, but by this point he'd sort of figured out what those phrases meant. And it was similar to sort of the type of thing you're talking about. It's like a beyond, I don't know if he would say beyond the world or whatever phrase you used for it, but he would certainly say beyond consciousness, beyond, and so there was this other sort of level that he'd sort of reached, which I would put, probably somewhere around location 6 or so.
Okay.
And he was talking to, he finally found these disciples of, these former disciples of Nisargadatta. Apparently a number of them were still in touch with each other, so he finally finds one, and then he finds the others. And the first thing he asks him, he says, is, like, what does this mean? And he said the first guy looked back at him and he said, what do you think it means? And so John was like, well, here's what I think it means, and he's like, yes. And so it was sort of this whole other thing, that the vast majority of people that bounced off of Nisargadatta and wrote the books or whatever apparently never really came to an understanding of, but that his serious inner circle of Indians did, and that John probably has. And so, but I think your question really sort of highlights the complexity, around all of this, of all of these different locations and different types, if you will, of this experience.
All right. So gosh, I have so many questions for you. It's hard to keep them straight, but a simple question maybe. So you talked about how the continuum, it's just as good to be at location 1 as location 3, and I would assume just as good to be at location 4 and location 6. Like it doesn't matter from your perspective, at least. No, maybe not from everyone's. But my question is, do you?
Not from everyone.
Yeah. So my question is, do you see a maturing process? Like, is it possible that that further along the continuum is some kind of a maturing, or do you not see it that way?
Do I see a maturing process? Good question. So I would say, and I'm playing with my views here to see if I can see more people.
Oh, yeah.
I would say that there's 2 ways to view this. Well, there's actually probably 4 ways, popular ways of viewing it. One way is to view maturation as basically deepening within a given location, right? And so, for instance, if you're a teacher and you believe it's all about love, and someone shows up on your doorstep in location 4,
Right.
You're going to think that person is messed up, that something went wrong with their transition to fundamental well-being, right? I mean,
Let me just say,
not to pick on, yeah.
I just want to say briefly to those who haven't read the book that location 4 has kind of transcended emotions, and so they're not going to be all about love and peace like location 3. Okay, please continue.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember I was I was watching Bernadette and that group of 13 people talk about, I was thinking she kept saying God's love, God's love, God's love, right? And I was thinking, given that the experience these folks were having with her, sort of social deconditioning and all of that, sooner or later, somebody's going to say, what does love mean to you? Right? And I thought, I'm gonna bring that up so that people can hear it. If by the end of this weekend or whatever it was, it didn't get brought up. But sure enough, about a day and a half in, somebody was like, what does God's love mean to you, right? And she talked about this force that came from like her lower abdomen that was like this continuous stream of energy or whatever. And she basically said, that's God's love. And somebody said, how in the world did you come to that being God's love? And she said, well, it's the only thing that's always there. So it has to be God's love. And so, that is not how someone in mainstream society would view the word love or God's love, right? That's a very different experience of that. There's no emotion associated with it or anything like that. And so I think that's one of the issues that sort of you get into with all of this, is that from one of these locations to another, things are so very different. What compassion looks like in location 4, what it looks like in location 3, what it looks like in location 2, what it looks like in location 1. Those are massively different things. By location 4, you're sort of like, sorry about your karma. I've got compassion for you, but I'm not going to do much for you. In location 3, you're like supremely helpful. You'd like totally want to live in an apartment building full of location 3 people. But probably not necessarily, heavily matured in location 4 people, right?
Right.
And location 2 people could be a crapshoot. It would sort of depend on their philosophy of non-duality and, and equanimity and, where they'd sort of come to with that. And also their programming up to that point. Because an interesting thing about location 2 is that people have a sense of there being a right way. And so, in location 2, it just feels like, okay, well, I have this choice. Even though that one doesn't make any sense, that feels like the right one. So that's what I'm going to do. And
would you say that's intuitive rather than thinking that right way? Do you know? Yeah. Very,
very intuitive.
Yes.
And one of the things that I wondered about in the research is, can I mess with that?
Yeah.
Is that, these people, they really felt like this is coming from a higher source. I'm just following the natural flow of life by following these answers. But, when I look across this population of people, right? And it's people sleeping under bridges to people who have Learjets. Right. I'm thinking to myself, this is not taking people to some uniform place. What's going on here with these deconditioning processes? And even people who were wealthy lost their wealth. I coach a lot of people out here in the Bay Area. It's a fluke of nature that sort of the people that I just got to know in the Bay Area when I first came here are basically the people who are in the investors and the people who start the companies and all of that. And so that's who I'm always around, and that's who I'm always having these conversations with. And as they transition, I try to sort of drill into them. Hey, listen, you're going to go through this deconditioning process, and it's going to be a freaking coin toss for you. You could wind up 5 years from now living with your kids or, having quadrupled your wealth. And if you just sort of follow this intuitive path, essentially it's not that different than just sort of flipping a coin and saying, I'm going to take this decision. Oh, now I'm going to take this decision. Now I'm going to take, I know it doesn't feel like that. It feels like absolute truth. It feels like you would never possibly want to resist it. Your mind associates all these synchronicities with when you, take a certain path. I tell people, take the other path and see what shows up for you in terms of synchronicity that way as well, because your mind is now sort of interpreting things in kind of a synchronistic way, and you're sort of pairing up this series of choices with that, and you get the idea.
Yeah, well, I do get the idea, and it's very interesting talking to you because your perspective sounds different than perspectives I've heard before, which is very interesting. Sure. So intuition. Am I hearing that you don't exactly believe in or trust intuition, that you think sometimes people would be better off to ignore it and follow their thinking.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay,
And,
that's what I thought I was hearing.
If you look into the intuition literature, I mean, if you think
Yeah.
about people like Danny Hahnemann or anybody who's really done a lot of research on intuition, there's a lot of work on that. Like the intuition system in humans is relatively well understood. And if you understand it, if you understand that literature, if you understand that research, and you sit down with a normal person or you sit down with someone in PNSE, it's pretty easy to see, which one's active, which one's not active, how it's relating to belief systems, all of that. Like there's no sort of special extra thing that seems to be the case for the people who are in fundamental well-being. Now, having said that, there is some exception to that, I think, in later locations. People in later locations start talking about, having increased accuracy and intuition, psychic premonitions, things like that. I have not explored that with any degree of empirical rigor because I'm not sure how to.
Yeah.
They just sort of happen in these flashes. You can't like sit them in front. They're not any better necessarily at like psychic tasks than, somebody who's just good at those tasks in general, but isn't in fundamental well-being. And so who knows if both of them have this pattern recognition system that is just picking it up, picking up the Zener card task better than the other people, or there's just no way to know about that from sort of a scientific standpoint, right? So, but I do, take them at their subjective experience that at least to them, it seems like, there has been an increase in accuracy. And an increase in premonitions and premonitions that come true and stuff like that, which you don't really hear out of people as much earlier on the continuum. And you only hear it, you only hear it sort of one way, past location 5. There's that in the book we talk about the fact that there's sort of 2 paths past location 5, path of humanity and the path of freedom. You really only hear it mostly on the path of freedom type people. The path of humanity people are really bringing back in some forms of love and emotion, and they're sort of scrambling back to feel more human because location 4 feels so alien.
Would it feel fair to say this? I'm just trying to translate briefly for everyone listening who hasn't read the book. So would it be fair to say that the path of humanity are those who awaken to a certain degree and then kind of swing back maybe as teachers or as in some way caring about humanity, where the path of freedom are people who just want to go further as far as they can go? Is that true?
No, I wouldn't put it that way. But that's a great way to set up the question.
Okay, good. Go ahead and explain that.
If you think about cultural programming, there's a big east-west split between the path of freedom and the path of humanity. Not entirely, like there's forms of Buddhism and stuff that have the path of humanity embedded in it. But just generally, if you just think about east-west, in east, the sort of views of this are twofold. Either stop at bodhisattva, right, and don't go all the way, or go all the way. And go all the way is really path of freedom. It's like hit location 4, have no sense of agency, no emotionality, no sense of the divine or panpsychist sense, all of that stuff that is in location 4, and just keep going. So that you're on location 5, path of freedom side, location 6, path of freedom, all the way until you hit 9. It's just the universe looking out your eyes, right? Roll over to 10, you're in a whole other batch of locations, a whole other type of destructuring and changes in your brain and whatnot happen at that point. So that's very different than how we're culturally trained in the West. That really doesn't exist as a notion in the West, right? I mean, if you think about all of the struggle that Bernadette went with when she fell off the end of location 3 into location 4, and she just had to somehow torture Christianity and Catholicism into her lived experience somehow. Right. So God's love becomes this force from her lower abdomen, which who the heck would describe it as that in her, Catholic tradition? Only her. Right, but she tried to sort of torture these things to get them into her belief system, we don't have that. We just don't have it in the West. It's, God's love and union with God, if it's anything, right? And so there's this sense of kind of remaining human and the importance of humanness and all of that. And location 3, it feels like, man, that's the peak in terms of being human. Like, it's just never going to get any better being human than location 3. We've got all these adjective tasks that we give people and stuff like that. And, when you sort them into what should be a bell curve distribution across locations and whatnot, like all of the good ones are right here at location 3, and they're like, there's a few over here at 1 and 2 maxed out. There's a few over here at 3 and 4, at 4 and 5 or whatever maxed out, right? But like, there's this giant spike right at location 3. You look at it and you just say to yourself, wow, okay, yeah, people are like, this is the peak of human experience. And then they fall off the end into location 4 and they don't feel human anymore. They feel alien. They're sitting across the dinner table from their kids and they don't feel any parental love. And they're like, what the heck is up with that? And so I think the typical Western reaction to that is, this is not really what I want. Unless they were really into like Kashmir Shaivism or, which some of them are, right? There are people in the West who have just been really, really into Advaita Vedanta or Kashmir Shaivism or, some sort of rainbow body Tibetan Buddhist thing or whatever else. And they're like, all right, I made it, now I'm going to the next one. That's rare. That's really, really rare in the West. And so I think there's a psychological coloring that is still very present in people's brains that tends to shunt people in the West if they move forward. What happens at location 4, as I said in the book, is 3 things. People either go back and they become what we call fluid 4s, which is they move usually between locations 2 to 4, oftentimes landing in one and sort of picking their favorite and not really being that fluid. Or they stick in location 4. They're like a Vedantist or something, like an Advaita Vedantist or something, and like location 4 sounds like the exact description. They'll sort of root right into that. Or they'll realize, well, geez, I've shifted a couple of times already. This probably isn't the last one. Wonder what's next. And they'll sort of leave their system open to progress further. And then they do, oftentimes. And so when they do, with that cultural programming from the West, they typically slide into the path of humanity, because there's just that, not having any love. These are just things that are so incredibly socially abhorrent and unacceptable, and that we've been programmed for a whole life are not okay. It's not okay to not care about people. It's not okay to, right? Whereas in the East, it's like there's a bullseye on that stuff if you're in a certain tradition, right? And so when you hit it, you're like, boom, So anyway, that's how I'd answer that.
Okay, then I
think
have
about these different ways of approaching it.
Okay, then I have another question. This fundamental well-being and all of these different locations on this continuum, which are each very different from the other locations, is all of this related to the brain only, or is there something beyond the brain that's involved?
I have no idea.
Oh, if that's a very honest answer.
Anybody that says they do have an idea just has no idea. Of course, there's got to be something beyond the brain, right? Because something is making the brain. There's some sort of quantum something that's generating all of this in the first place, and whatever else. But in terms of, I think the way people normally ask that is in terms of subjective experience. Is subjective experience generated in the brain, or is subjective experience somehow outside of and beyond the brain? And, I speak at all kinds of stuff every year. And so I've been on the dais with every near-death researcher and every out-of-body researcher, know all those guys well. We're all friends. And so I'm familiar with their work, and their work is fascinating. I remember Pim van Lommel, like the guy who sort of started the near-death experience space. He was telling me how he got into it. He said that he was a cardiac guy. He was a cardiac doctor, basically, in Northern Europe somewhere, wherever Van Lommel would be from. And he basically got the first set of like paddles, to like resuscitate people with. And the very first time he used them, person comes back to life, his first thought was something like, I'm a hero, this technology is amazing, you know, those types of thoughts, right? But the guy in a split second came back, and the guy was so furious. He was like so angry. And Pim was like, I just saved your life. He's like, I was in the most peaceful, amazing place, and it's your fault that I'm back here, right? And so Pim was like, what the hell? You know, he just became fascinated by it from that moment on. And he started. So, I mean, who knows, right? I don't have any idea. There's nothing in our data or anything that gives me any clue about what's true in terms of ultimate reality or anything like that.
Well, in fact, that just hits my next question, but maybe we already answered it, but let me ask it anyway. You know, I read in your book, of course, that regardless of where people were on the location, they perceived that as the truth. And you even said that if a person was in location 3, that's what was true. If they would then go to location 4, nope, it wasn't 3, 4 is true. And if they happened to go back, oops, 4 wasn't true, it's 3 is true. So my question is, because, you know, many people on this path are seeking truth. Does that word have any meaning? Is there any such thing as truth based on your research?
Well, they're seeking ultimate truth.
Yes, ultimate truth.
It's usually the way they express it. And no, you know, I have to say, I don't think it does. Let me give a little color to what you just said.
Okay.
You know, when you go from 4 to 3, you still remember your perspective at 4. And you definitely remember that it's a valid perspective when you're in 4. But it's not your current valid perspective because you're in 3. And so it's not like 4's perspective becomes invalidated in some way in a scenario like that. It's just not the operating rules, so to speak, in terms of what feels true.
Yeah, I understand that, you know, because, I'll tell you how my reference for understanding, and feel free to say anything that you want to say to this. But there was a quote by Nisargadatta that I contemplated very deeply for quite some time. And in the quote, basically, and I'm not good at remembering words word for word, so pardon my paraphrasing. But the idea was that the light that you are is the reality, and that you bring the reality to whatever you're perceiving. So if my reality is the ultimate reality, let's put an if there. If my reality is the ultimate reality, then whatever I'm perceiving now is going to seem real because it's in my light. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Sure.
Okay, sure. So that makes sense to me.
And that's the reason why people ask me, did you transition? When did you transition? All of that. And it became really clear to me from just the first few subjects that I didn't dare transition, because I could have never conducted that study. They were all just so biased in these different directions, and you couldn't talk them out of it. And I thought to myself, crap, that's going to happen to me.
Yes.
And so I held myself out of it for a very long time until really the research was so mature. This was honestly completely my rationale at the time. The research is so mature at this point that if I get hit by a bus, or if I, land in location 4, I'm advocating that everything I've said up to that point is wrong, there's enough people that will just be like, Jeffrey really had it together up until 2010, but just kind of ignore everything he said after that. And we've just kind of continued on with the research over here. And he comes by every now and then, and we're like, oh, hi, Jeffrey. I just figured that it had enough steam, that it would continue on its own path. And when I felt comfortable with that, then I transitioned.
Yeah, I found it very interesting, actually, when I was reading your book. I should tell you that we have a couple of focuses here at Awakening Together. One of the focuses in my language, it's my language they all copy, I think. One of the focuses is what I call purification, which you might call undoing the conditioning of the mind, actively undoing your conditioning. The other is self-awareness practice, which I know you're very familiar with, just remaining aware of awareness. So through this this practice of actively deconditioning the mind. There are all kinds of ideas and beliefs and thoughts that have just totally dropped away. And so it was very interesting to me to read, you know where I'm going, don't you? To read about these finders who still seem to have so many beliefs, so many ideas that I am right. You said there was even sexism and racism. That was surprising to me. So I guess part of my question is there a difference then between self-awareness and deconditioning of the brain? And do they not necessarily go together? You want to talk about that when you're done drinking?
Great question. Not in the book. I should have put it in the book. I don't know why I didn't put it in the book. It's not like I didn't have 10 years to do it. But not in the book for some reason. We just have to trust that it's just not meant to be there.
Okay.
Is this notion. So probably everybody's familiar with Ivan Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs and this notion that...
Another one of the 5 we can mention, right?
Right. Another one of the 5 people can mention, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, just for anybody that doesn't know, he basically came up with sort of discovered conditioning, classical conditioning, as it's referred to, behaviorism in the academic academy for psychology, which was the dominant thing for decades. And the most simple example of it is you give a dog a food, it salivates, right? You ring a bell, don't give the dog food, it doesn't salivate. There's nothing that says the bell is associated with food, right? You give the dog food, you ring the bell, you keep doing that, and its nervous system, basically its brain learns, oh, hey, when there's a bell, there's going to be food, I should start salivating, right? Mm-hmm. And then you stop giving the dog food, and you keep ringing the bell, and eventually its nervous system figures out, hey, it turns out that bell never had anything to do with food. No reason for me to keep salivating when this bell thing is going. And so there's sort of this curve of learning, essentially, in the brain. And that learning system is active in all of us in every moment. And so, you have no idea right now why you're sitting the way you are. Mm-hmm. No one who's listening to this has any idea why they're sitting the way they are, why they're nodding their head, not nodding their head, fidgeting with something, not fidgeting with something, whatever it is that's going on. But it's a result of our body and our brain having done millions of experiments, probably way more than that, over the course of our lifetimes. And it's optimized in some way. In you and I's case, we're talking back and forth, right? And so in our case, it's a human interaction loop, and it's optimal. You've learned, okay, if I keep nodding, it's people like that. He'll keep talking probably, and maybe
that's what I'm nodding.
Whatever else, right? And I've learned similar things on my side around. I should move my eyebrows more, or whatever my brain has learned, right?
Yes.
About making a point, I should probably not talk like this all the time. Or whatever my body's learned through all of this experimentation. But if you ask me, like I just was waving my arms, right? If you're asking, like, why did you just wave your arms? I have no idea why I just waved my arms, right? Now, if you really ask someone, they will make up an answer, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, well, I was feeling expansive, or whatever crap my brain would come up with, right? But it's just bullshit. I have no idea really why I was waving my arms. I'm waving my arms because that's what I'm programmed to do. Like Pavlov's dogs were programmed to salivate when they heard the bell ring. And so it seems like sort of, let me see if I can see myself on here somewhere. Seems sort of out here, if you imagine sort of, let me just scooch over a little. Everybody see that okay?
Yes, perfect. We're supposed to see your head and your hand. Here, that's what we see, yeah.
That's right. So out here, thanks, Don. Out here, you've sort of got this layer of conditioning, and that's what you and I are interacting with right now. Because you don't know why you're nodding your head. I don't know why I'm varying my voice. We can make up stories about all of that. But it's just this sort of programmed outer layer of us, and it's this accumulation of an enormous amount of conditioning. So you've sort of got this out here. Right? And it's kind of its own system. It's doing its own thing in every moment. You can't really turn it off. I mean, you can get brain damage or something and maybe shut it off. But it also sort of involves peripheral nerves. It's kind of a complicated thing. So you really have to do some serious damage to shut that thing off. And then kind of back here somewhere, you have a sense of self, right? That's not really this thing, although they really kind of think that they're the same thing, right? It seems to this thing like it's the same thing as this thing out here. It's really not, because this thing can't really say why this thing is waving its hand right now, right? And so they're really sort of separated. And that there's a loop. There's a feedback loop that goes between them, right? So, you know, I mean, your kids come over, your mom or some other, or your spouse or some family member comes over and they sort of trigger something here, right? They push your buttons in some way, something that stirs up some major conditioning out here, not the minor stuff like we're just social graces and stuff that we're dealing with right now. It's going to trigger a loop. It's going to like loop back to this sense of self. It's going to get programmed. You know, it's going to provide its feedback in some way. It's not going to be totally deterministic of what happens out here. You know, when you touch a hot stove, for instance, it doesn't really matter what your sense of self is. You know, if your sense of self is like, God, I love hot stoves, you're still not going to touch the hot stove again, right? But it sort of informs it in some way, right? It provides some sort of read into it. And one thing that it does is it sort of checks the state of the individualized sense of self back here, right? Well, most people's states are anxious, worried, not very happy, whatever else. So when it checks in, ordinarily that's what it gets. And that's what sort of gets written to this outer layer out here. Of course, there are happy things in the loops and stuff too, right? And so then you have a transition in your consciousness, and this sense of self changes in some way. Did this change? Not usually, right? Not unless you have some really difficult transition. And they might not call it a difficult transition, right? They might call it like this amazingly profound spiritual blah, 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 right? But from a nervous system standpoint, it would be like a really traumatic sort of change in the brain that did a massive amount of rewiring. It reached all the way down to deconditioning some of this stuff out here in a major way. Ordinarily, that doesn't happen for the average person that transitions to fundamental well-being, right? And so what happens is you have this change back here, but this is still basically there. And it's still essentially intact. And then for the next couple of years, you go through a deconditioning process that's quite intense. It can be 3 months. It can be 3 years. On average, for people that aren't doing like tons of extra stuff trying to accelerate it, it's usually a couple of years. And that 2 years is an extremely important thing to someone in fundamental well-being. It's really the thing that sort of sets the course for the rest of your life, right? It's the period of time that determines whether or not you're going to be living in your kid's basement. No dig meant there on Bernadette, or you know, you're going to be like thriving in the world in some sort of amazing way and having massive impact across trillions of people and, you know, whatever else. And, you know, aliens are coming to visit you from foreign lands because they've heard about how amazing you are across the galaxy. And right, whatever that range is of potential difference. So what happens over time is essentially, you know, constantly as you go throughout your day, this is getting hit. And this loop is coming back, and it slowly gets rewritten over time. And that's what we see as part of this deconditioning process. And the more something gets hit, the more the more sort of it gets reprogrammed out here. And if you wind up with like a location 4 thing back here, right, then this thing keeps getting hit, keeps getting hit, keeps getting hit, keeps getting hit. You wind up with Bernadette's, you know, the guy leaves because he can't take another minute just from the introductions.
Right.
And it's, you know, oh, that happens all the time.
Right.
Kind of response, right? It's like, oh, there's nothing wrong with that out here in her world now, right? I mean, I think probably if we'd caught her 50 years before that, she would have had a very different view of what was unfolding there and probably been a lot more, you know, about Christian charity and hospitality or whatever, right? So that's a good way, I think, to think about this conditioning stuff.
Okay, so again, a couple of questions. And by the way, you've already stayed longer than an hour, so maybe we're going our 90 minutes. Unless you have to run, let me know, because, you know, I'll take whatever happens. But my next question is, so from the way you explain this, you know, with the self here and the conditioning here, it sounds to me like a big deconditioning could happen and there still be a sense of self. Or
for sure,
a sense of self could fall away and there could still be a lot of conditioning, right? So the two are not directly related. So that's important, I think, for people to realize.
The entire self-help industry is trying to mess with this.
Right. Right. Okay, so the other thing that, oh shoot, please don't leave me yet. Please come back. Okay, the other thing thank you. The other thing I wanted to ask was, we talked about the fact that truth is perceived wherever one seems to be now, that this seems to be true. And whether there's an ultimate truth or not, it's difficult to say from the research. But would you say it's true that there are things that are not true and that can be defined? For example, conditioning is not true, or the sense of self is not true, or the things that can be defined that way?
Sure.
That's
Maybe
it.
everything is not true. Tough to say.
Okay.
No, I'm not quite that far, but
But
yeah,
maybe
sure.
it's more
And
looking
we're
for the
talking
not
about
true.
truth in like a subjective meaning sense when we're talking about truth. We're not talking about like whether or not this table is, something I can bang my knee on,
Right.
or something like that, right?
Yeah. I think people are definitely looking for something beyond when they're looking for what they call ultimate truth. But to me, that's an important point, that maybe truth can't be defined, but things that aren't true can be noticed and can be contemplated and let go. Maybe that's important. Location one. Let's talk about location one.
Although, think about,
go ahead.
To add on to that, though, think about, like, let's say that you're in location 3, right? And let's just go to the social conditioning thing that we keep picking on. In location 3, I mean, maybe in location 2, you were classic, neo-Advaita, non-dual, equanimity, not exactly lovey-dovey, whatever else. And so your interactions with people, this outer shell and how people interacted with you, it was programmed in a certain way, right? And then you have a transition to location 3. Let's just, for expediency, say it was a profound transformation to location 3, so this thing got reprogrammed quick, right? Now it's, what you might have considered your truths about people and interacting with people or whatever in location 2 that were very true to you in location 2, they're not true to you anymore in location 3. And if you move to location 4, they're not going to be, the location 3 and 2 truths aren't going to be as true to you in location 4. And so even there's this degree of subjectivity around all of that across these different locations. Yeah.
Okay, well, let me ask you this question. Is it possible, or maybe it's even more than possible, that all of those different perceptions, what I perceive to be true in location 3 and what I perceive to be true in location 4, that those are all false, and the only thing that's true is the perceiver? Because that's the same in all of the locations, right?
Sure. In this context of truth, I think that's often where people arrive at.
Okay. And then my next question is about location 1. Now, location 1 is location 1 for a reason. Like, before that, you're not on the continuum. And let's pretend for a moment. I know not everybody wakes up to location 1, but let's just pretend for a minute you go to 1, 2, 3, just pretending. What's the difference between 1 and beyond and not on the continuum? What's the one thing that makes people be on the continuum? I know you've used the words fundamental well-being, but if you could describe it differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the average person, most people, let's just say, have a psychological foundation that is primarily rooted in a sense of discontentment. The way I often describe this is, imagine that you're eating outside and you have a little bread and you toss a little crumb to a bird. What does the bird do, right? Does the bird, sort of, oh, it's a crumb. Savor the crumb. Can't wait for the next bite of this crumb, right? No, it doesn't do that, right? It takes a peck of the crumb and then it's like, what's going to kill me? Something's going to kill me. Oh, peck. What's going to kill me, right? So the animal kingdom is basically like in this perpetual sense of threat, or in this perpetual sense that something might not be quite right in this moment. Mm-hmm. And so are people, because we're just animals, really. We don't like to think of ourselves as just animals. But that's basically the foundation, it's quote unquote the problem of the human condition, is that sort of psychological foundation. that we have, thank God, to survive. You know, if it's probably still needed if you live in the Brazilian rainforest. Maybe it's a lot less needed if you're in a $4 million mansion in Redwood City right now, like I am. And so if you think about this, in a way, what we're talking about, just coming onto the continuum, is in a way an upgrade to really modernity for most humans. Not appropriate, I'm sure, for all humans that are living in all conditions everywhere in the world right now, but for some of us, it makes a lot more sense for me to feel fundamentally sort of safe and like things are okay, and I don't really need to be worrying about what I need to add to myself, or it feels okay for me to have a sense of fundamental okayness about this moment, right? I'm not going to starve walking to the next berry bush. I'm not worried about a wild animal rushing into this room, making it past the gate, right? And into and then the however many layers of rooms are between me and the door, for it to, you know, get to me. So that is the primary delimiter. And it took me a long time to realize it, because I was looking at the trees and not the forest.
Yes.
And I remember I had this really difficult drive from Springfield, Illinois to whatever is in Indiana by Chicago. Can't remember the name of it right now. Fort Wayne, maybe. Where I was driving from one research subject to another research subject. And the last research subject in St. Louis had it's not in St. Louis, in Springfield, Illinois, had somehow managed to like cross the last item off my list that I thought was common across all research subjects. And really, I thought he just killed any hope of finding meaning across this research population or defining them by anything. I wasn't in fundamental well-being back then, and so it was a very hard drive. I was crying. I mean, it was like a devastating moment in my life, right? And by the time I made it to Fort Wayne, Indiana, however far that was, a few hours or whatever it was, it's probably 3-4 hours. I had this epiphany that I'd missed the entire thing. You know, that there was that I was looking at all of these little trees, trying to see how many people shared the same tree. Mm-hmm. That there was this entire forest that all of these trees were in. And somehow I had just completely missed it. And what I had really missed was this fundamental psychological shift, that people go from this sense of discontentment to this sense that things are okay. Not in a bad way. I mean, if somebody does rush in here with a gun, I'm not non-functional, right? I'm not like, oh, a gun, you know, oh, it's so cute. Go ahead, shoot me. You know, I mean, it'll probably be, I don't know what I'd be doing. Probably throwing the monitor I'm looking at you in.
Yeah, I could call 911 for you.
I appreciate that, except you don't know where I am.
That's true.
So, 8
yeah.
Fulton Court. Right now.
Okay, got it.
So if you think about, if you really think about what changes onto location 1, that's what changes. What changes with location 2 is that certain, you know, that certain types of non-duality. What changes with location 3 is the falling away of the non-duality and the coming in of the single emotion of love and joy and all of that, and the union thing. Changes in location 4 is the divine thing falling, the panpsychist divine thing falling away, the emotions falling away, the sense of agency falling away. These are like the big things. What changes in location 5 is those big changes in the visual system. And so there are sort of hallmarks that we've learned to look for across these different locations.
What about that sense of self? Is the sense of self gone in location 1, or is it there in some of the locations and it drops away later?
No, it's definitely there. I mean, I think one could argue that it maybe never goes away. It just seems like it does. You know, one thing that's fascinating that sort of happens from one, I mean, you can be in location 7, right? And you have a transition to location 8, and you're like, whoa, where did all of that part of me come from? Like, how come I haven't been seeing that for the last 32 years, or, you know, whatever else. And so I think you get to the point where you accept that it feels in a lot of these locations, not in location 1, but in a lot of these locations, that there isn't really a sense of self and in the way that you classically constructed it. Though certainly there's a big difference in that between 2 and 3 and 3 and 4 and whatever else. So there's shifts in it. along the way. I think those are covered up a lot by people just writing the same dang thing in their books. You know, the sense of self go, the individual self goes, or whatever, which, by the way, is horrifying for the average person to read, and probably should not be written in any book anyway. Because, you know, the average person spends their entire life building up their sense of self. It's the one project that they've engaged in since age 3 or something. When the narrative when the episodic memory stuff comes online in your brain, 2.5 to 3.5, somewhere in that range. So the last thing that people want to read about is that goes away. And they think, you know, it's this thing out here is part of it that goes away, right? All of that hard work that they've done on being a functional person and how they're relating to the world and whatever else. And then they read something from, you know, Tolle or something about sleeping on a park bench for 2 years, and it just totally reinforces it. And they don't realize, no, that was like a crazy, far out there, one could even say pathological transition to this in some sense, you know?
Yeah.
The average person doesn't have anything like that in a transition to that location.
Okay, so that's interesting. And of course, you did say that, you know, the average person has spent, you know, maybe since age 3, building up that sense of self. So what about those of us who have a goal of rediscovering what was there before we built up that sense of self? What do you think of that? Because obviously, if we built it up, we kind of made it up, right? We chose, I mean, I watched my daughter make up her sense of self. I watched her choose what she wanted to identify with. And a lot of it was based on peers and other influences, had nothing to do with her.
Yeah, right? Totally. Absolutely. You know, I personally think it's better to not have, you know, to make the transition to fundamental well-being. So I think it's a perfectly fine goal. I'm definitely not one of those people that say there's no way to get there. You can't get there from the ego or whatever. I mean, we've got hundreds of people that we've got data on that got there from their ego, for crying out loud, right? I mean, how could you possibly say that?
Well, in fact, we now only have about 8 minutes left. Do you want to talk about the Finder's course? Because I know there's one starting on August 3rd.
Great. There is. Good to know.
Yeah.
I'm a little separate from that part of the experiment at this point.
Yeah.
We run them every other month, so that would be about right, because I think one started in June. So you're right. August would probably be the next one. Yeah, I mean, you know, that's basically our experiment. That was our experiment in getting people to this place. Yeah, let me say where it comes from, because I think it's useful to have the framework, because you can use the framework, right, without taking the program. And one of the things that so I think it's a lot easier to transition to this than, as far as I can tell, everybody else does. Part of that is just because we've seen it so many times, you know. I mean, you know, we think that probably 3% of people that take the Finder's course transition in the first couple of days. Right? I mean, people regard that kind of stuff as impossible. But when you understand our framework, I think you don't think that way anymore. And so I think even if people can just sort of grasp a certain framework, it's really helpful. Take the course, they don't take the course, it doesn't matter, but if they can sort of grasp the framework, I think that's really important. So the framework basically comes from the first phase of the research. And what we did was, what I assumed was that we would be zapping people into fundamental well-being a lot sooner than today. And it just turned out that the regions of interest in the brain were too deep, and there wasn't an existing technology that could reach them cleanly. And it's just in the past year that's evolved as like a safe thing to do for people with this one technology. We've been tracking this technology for years, 10 years probably, interfacing with all of the researchers in the space, helping them as much as we can to try to help the technology mature for this moment. You know, they're trying to get it for Parkinson's and stuff like that, and we're like, you know, trying to do it for this, right? Which is a little bit of kind of, I think, funny to them in some cases. Not all of them. Some of them, like there's a guy at Harvard who's one of the great ultrasound guys named Shun-Sik Yu, and he's also a Korean with a Buddhist background, and so he totally gets, you know, why you would want to do it with this. But the rest of them are sort of, you know, not into this stuff, right? They're like waking people up from comas and stuff like that with it. So bottom line is, it took a long time to get to the technology stuff, and it's going to be a long time yet before the technology stuff makes it out into the world. And so we needed something to do that A/B data testing with. And after we crossed every single technology off the list, we sort of just had the descriptive data to go on. And so what we did was we went back, and I know this sounds like something that you would have done right away, but there was a question that we asked people on the intake form to be a subject in the research, and that was, what worked for you? And the thing is, I thought that they were so biased that I probably wouldn't get a straight answer, or that they wouldn't even be able to provide me with an accurate answer to that question. But that was, at a certain point, all we had. And so I, had a research assistant go back and score that and categorize the data, and which is a huge job. And it turned out that a relatively small category of things, a handful of categories of techniques, were what people answered. But it also turned out that people had done more than one of them in many cases, right? And so it was sort of like, well, how come, like, if you do these 5 things, like this one works for you, but these other ones, and then it sort of dawned on us, oh, there's a matching problem here. So not only do you have to, like, somehow have randomly lucked into one of these things that works, but then you've got to somehow match up to this thing. And if it doesn't, if I give you 3, right, and none of the 3 are for you, then who cares that I gave you 3? I've just wasted your time, essentially, right? So we spent a year basically putting these things in different orders, playing with different versions of them, and sort of this trying to create this cocktail, because we couldn't, in the psych data, match any of the psychological data, which was a lot. We had a lot of psychological data on these people. We couldn't match any of our data up to what worked for someone to transition them with these methods. There's just like a complete gap there. And so I thought, well, the only thing we can really do is have people systematically progress their way through these things. And then it became a question of, should you put one before another one? Is there some sort of ordering that's beneficial here? Blah, blah, blah. So we spent a year working all that out. We spent a year figuring out some of these throw people into these crazy dark night of the soul experiences. So we had to figure out a way to engineer around those things. And it was like a lot of work. But at the end of it, what we wound up with was basically a framework that allowed people to find the thing that worked for them. About 70+% of people find the thing that worked for them. It's not 100%. It's not everybody that comes and uses the protocol, but it's enough that if you spend $3,000 on someone to give them a pre-scan for fMRI, you haven't totally thrown away $3,000. It wasn't like 0% or 1% or 2% or the things that have been done before. And so it was a high enough thing that you could justify research with neuroscience and stuff on it at a cost basis. And so that's the framework, right? So the thing that I think most people need to take away from that phase of our research is it's a fit problem. It's basically about finding the thing that works for you.
Yeah.
And once you do, you can go like that.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. In fact, we only have about a minute left, but that is one of the things that I read in your book, that the people who progress the quickest were those who found what worked for them and stuck with it, meaning which spiritual practice we'll call it for now. Those who stuck with the practice just because maybe a teacher told them to, but it wasn't working for them, they progressed the slowest. And therefore, people who kind of experimented with different practices and found the 1 or 2 that worked for them also progressed very quickly. So it's kind of all about the language we use here, which I know you don't use, is following your own internal guidance, right? Being, responsible for yourself and your own, we'll call it transition into fundamental well-being. Do you know Craig Holliday?
Sure. Yeah,
he's on next, which means we have to get out of here. It's his turn.
Right.
So,
my love.
Yeah, and Jeffrey, I want to thank you.
Let me just say real quickly, I do think people can follow their intuition to the right methods.
Okay.
Provided they've sort of programmed their intuition in the right ways. It relates to how your subconscious seems to be programmed and all that.
Yeah, and I think there's an intelligence to intuition, and I think some people use intuition in a crazy way, and how someone can find the intelligence and know whether they're doing the the crazy way or this intelligent way. I don't know how to explain that, but I think there's an inner intelligence, and it's a matter of figuring out what that is, right?
Absolutely.
So yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. We appreciate it, and
there's Craig. Yeah, I can see him.
Yeah.
Hey, Craig. Enjoy the show, man. Actually, maybe I'll just hang out for a minute here. I got to
Yeah,
get to
sure.
a dinner, but I think I'll just hang out and see how you kick it off.
Yeah, and I just want to say one more time, if y'all are interested in reading Jeffrey's book, it's called The Finders by Dr. Jeffrey A. Martin. And and this will be posted on YouTube too, so people will be able to watch it there if they didn't hear it live or on the radio or on our website. There's so many ways to hear it. Thank you, Jeffrey. Don, the mic is yours.
Thank you.